The tower had grounded everything. Whiteout over the pass, winds over 80 knots, nothing cleared for launch. They had tried the top-line crews, precision-trained, mission-ready, but no one made it past the ridge. Near the far pad, a Blackhawk sat untouched. No call sign, no co-pilot, just one woman checking the trim with bare hands. Her badge didn't give her flight status. Her name wasn't even on the list. She lifted anyway, and the silence followed her all the way in. The wind was already rising when she stepped onto the tarmac, her boots crunching lightly through the brittle crust of overnight snow. White rolled off the mountains like breath, the sky a hard blank above the ridge. Nothing moved easily in this weather. The UH-60s and CH-47s sat with their rotors still, their outlines softened by the mist curling through the base. Around them, clusters of crew in high-visibility flight suits moved with clipped urgency, voices muffled by fleece collars and layered hoods. They carried tablets and checklists, snapped helmets into place, adjusted straps, spoke in jargon-heavy shorthand. She walked alone, her pace steady. Gray admin blouse buttoned clean to the collar. Black utility pants marked faintly with the outline of knee rests. Clipboard tucked under one arm. Her gloves swung quietly from the side of her belt. Not worn. Not needed yet. She didn't glance at the others or angle her path toward them. The snow fell in small, directionless flakes. Too soft to sting, but cold enough to cling. She moved like she didn't mind. One crew chief glanced her way and nudged the tech beside him. "Dead weight still on the field," he muttered. Not loud, but not quiet either. The younger man followed his gaze, made a small sound in the back of his throat that might have been amusement. "She's not even slotted today," he said, and turned back to his checklist. Near the far end of the line, someone adjusted a tie-down strap and called out without looking. "She's just here to observe." Probably tracking clipboards, not people. Nobody corrected him. She reached the edge of the ops tent just as a gust rolled in, lifting the edge of the canvas flap and snapping it against the pole. Inside, the air was warm and crowded. Coffee steam curled above a battered metal urn. The table beside it scattered with comm links and laminated flight maps. A radio crackled with unreadable static. The storm had reached the upper ridgeline. Visibility was dropping every 10 minutes. The woman stepped through the flap and paused. No one greeted her. A junior lieutenant passed on her right and didn't make eye contact. Someone farther in laughed at something too quiet to hear. She scanned the whiteboard near the entrance. Each helicopter slot was marked. Red and green ink, denoting readiness. Every crew had been assigned. Every bird tagged with initials and roles. Her name wasn't anywhere. She didn't react. Instead, she stepped closer and angled her clipboard toward the corner of the manifest. One flight slot sat blank, unclaimed. A notation beside it read, K-9 unit, Charlie, handler pending. The coordinates listed a grid square up near the comm relay ridge, near the break line where the trail cut hard against exposed rock. A voice behind her spoke without directing itself at anyone. "They'll have to wait. Nothing's flying in this." There was no disagreement. Someone chuckled. "Dog'll probably ride it out better than the handler." She didn't turn. Her fingers stayed loose around the edge of the clipboard. The gloves at her belt moved gently as the heater kicked on again, warm air stirring her blouse at the sleeves. From the rear of the tent, a crew lead with snow still melting off his shoulders raised his voice. "Slot 8's a ghost. Nobody's on it." A taller man shrugged. "Then lock it out. No point logging ghosts." She remained at the board another moment, then stepped back. No one moved to speak to her. The laughter had already shifted to something else. Another line about battery packs or flare misfires. She let the canvas flap fall behind her and stepped back into the wind. Outside, the light had flattened. It wasn't dawn anymore, just a gray wash across white and steel. The mountain pass had disappeared behind thickening fog. She stood for a second longer, watching the shadowed outlines of the aircraft ahead of her. The helicopters were nearly ready. Crews moved around them like clockwork, adjusting ladders, clipping carabiners, raising cargo platforms into place. The noise was constant, but impersonal. One rotor spun lazily, testing torque. Another bird stayed idle, its engine quiet, skids frosted. She walked toward the unused UH-60 and stopped a few meters away. No one called out. No one told her to move along. She didn't touch the aircraft. She didn't climb in or circle it. She stood for exactly 10 seconds, letting the cold find the crease behind her collar, and then turned away. Back across the lot, a flight tech leaned against a fuel cart and watched her pass. He didn't smile. "She's not cleared," he said quietly. His partner didn't respond. The wind picked up again, scattering fine snow across the tarmac, erasing her footprints before they reached the edge of the hangar. Her bunk sat at the end of the long, narrow row, just past the noise of the communal showers and far enough from the fuel heaters that the air stayed cold. There was no curtain, just a thin gray blanket folded with the edge facing out, a cot with one crease running diagonally across the center, and a weather-stained duffel tucked beneath. On the wall above the pillow, a laminated terrain overlay had been tacked at all four corners. The ink had faded along the fold lines. Wind currents were drawn in black pen across the ridgelines, each arrow labeled by hand, not by system. An old tablet lay charging on the crate beside the cot. Its screen blinked quietly with a looping model of the upper pass airflow. She tapped the corner with one knuckle. A side menu pulled up a calibration tool, and she adjusted a slider down to 600 meters elevation, just to confirm the inversion line hadn't shifted. It hadn't. The storm would push west, and then dip. She watched the simulation run through another pass before setting the tablet down. Beneath it sat her logbook, the kind no one asked her to keep. The front cover was worn smooth, the elastic band stretched from use. Inside were pages of personal entries, not diary pages, not narrative, just numbers, notes, rows of uncredited data. One column held timestamps. Another marked flight patterns she had remapped by hand after simulated failures. There were dozens of entries, most dated after she had been grounded, all of them hers alone. She picked up the pen tucked into the spine and scrolled back 4 pages. Her handwriting was neat, but compact, the kind of writing done in half light without wasted space. She added one new line at the bottom. 4 minutes of low-altitude trim modulation from the night before. Simulated, yes, but based on real storm feeds logged last year during a southern blizzard extraction. She closed the book softly and exhaled once through her nose. On the metal shelf above the cot rested 3 things: a folded thermal map, a cloth-wrapped set of gloves, and a photo, taped at the corners with weatherproof film. The image showed a younger version of her, a different flight suit, and a K-9 with snow frozen to its flank. The handler knelt beside them, his hand resting on the dog's back. All 3 looked toward the aircraft behind them. The tail number was partially obscured, but she remembered the angle, remembered the cold, remembered that no one else had come that day, either. The gloves had belonged to her father. The lining had worn thin years ago, but the leather still held its shape. She used them for checklist work now, not because they were lucky, but because the motion mattered. He had taught her that. Cold weather pilots didn't learn by temperature. They learned by feel. He used to fly ridge runs for weather data in a battered single-engine utility craft with doors that didn't close all the way. She would ride in the back as a kid, wrapped in surplus canvas, watching trees blur beneath them. He would shout instructions over the engine, pointing to air brakes and thermals, drawing shapes on laminated cards with a wax pencil while flying one-handed. He had never liked training videos. Feel it or don't fly, he'd say. She had felt it. Now, when she walked an aircraft, she followed his sequence. Right boot taps the left skid. Right hand runs the belly seam. Glove checks latch tension, not just visually but by pull. 3 seconds at the nose cone, 2 seconds at the tail boom. She didn't do it for others to see. She did it because the body remembers better than the mind when the cold starts cutting through. She sat back on the cot and reached beneath it. From the duffel, she pulled out a rolled segment of map paper, already soft from folding. This one wasn't issued. She had drawn it herself based on older terrain charts and field photos she had pulled from archived folders during off hours. It showed the pass from 4 angles, annotated with known downdraft points, elevation changes, and unstable shelf zones where rotor wash could collapse the climb. She unrolled it and set it flat beside the logbook. The pass where the K-9 team had been last logged was marked with a yellow tab. She didn't move it. Instead, she leaned on one elbow and traced the contour line with her finger. 70 meters below the ridgeline, angled between 2 rock walls. It was flyable. Barely. But only from one direction. And only if you knew when to bleed speed and pitch before the second break. She had flown it in simulation 10 times. Once in real weather, 5 years ago, when she had ridden co-pilot for a winter resupply run. That pilot had retired 2 months later. She hadn't forgotten the angle. The wind howled briefly outside, slapping snow against the thin wall panels. She glanced once toward the bunk curtain across the aisle, still drawn. No one stirred. She returned to the tablet, reopened the flight simulator app, and cued the next scenario. A storm drift profile at 800 meters with wind shear spike. She tapped through the opening sequence and gripped the controls without comment. She didn't fly with music, didn't wear a headset unless it was for calibration. She just sat, one hand on the trim, one eye on the model, and flew it again. The motion was quiet, familiar, purposeful. Later, she folded the gloves and placed them back on the shelf. She adjusted the thermal map once, smoothing the corner where it had curled. The pen clicked softly back into the logbook spine. She turned off the tablet and stretched once, letting the cold reach her neck before standing. Nothing had changed on the manifest outside. No one had called her name, but the storm had shifted by just enough to matter, and she knew, without question, that the air over that pass would be harder by morning. The inside of the operations tent felt 10 degrees warmer than the outside air, but the cold wasn't gone. It hung along the floor, crept around the ankles, and curled against the base of every steel support. Visibility outside had dropped to near zero. The whiteout blurred the plastic windows, reducing the world to bright noise. Radios buzzed and flickered. The wind pressed against the side walls in short bursts, each gust flexing the canvas slightly inward. She stepped in with her gloves folded in one hand and the clipboard tucked tight against her ribs. Her boots left small, wet prints on the entry mat, though no one turned to see. Inside, the briefing group stood tight around the center display. Pilots, squad leads, one logistics officer, and 2 techs flanking a tablet. The generator hummed beside the fuel heater. It was loud enough to mask casual voices, not loud enough to make them stop. The manifest board had been moved to a standing easel, names written in dry erase blue and red, some underlined, others crossed out. She scanned it once. Her name wasn't there, not even in support. One row near the bottom had a short blank space, just a hyphen where initials should be K-9 team, handler code inactive, last known location marked to the east, well into the pass. She took a single step forward. No one shifted to make room. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. One team's still out there. The words slid between 2 conversations without slowing either. A logistics officer didn't look up. A pilot with frost still clinging to his collar glanced at her, then back to the screen. Another officer, gray hair pulled back into a clipped knot, waved a hand vaguely in her direction. No lift. Not in this. We've got visibility at less than 50 meters. Her fingers stayed still around the clipboard. They're static, she said. They haven't moved in over 90 minutes. It's a K-9 handler and his dog. The first reply came without hesitation. Too risky for one dog, the older man said. Not unkindly, just as if the math had already been done and the result was permanent. Across the table, someone else muttered. We're not scrambling for a 4-legged asset. We've got live crews grounded. Another chuckle. Let her take a snowcat if she cares that much. That one got a ripple of laughter. Not loud, not mean, just enough to seal it. She didn't move. She didn't flinch or shift weight. The space around the group remained tight, backs angled toward her, bodies slightly hunched inward. Nobody invited her in. Nobody asked for clarification. The manifest board stayed untouched. A younger pilot blonde, clean-shaven, not much older than 25, glanced up from the tablet. For a moment, his eyes met hers. He didn't smile, but he didn't look away immediately either. His hand paused above the screen like he might gesture toward something. Then, he lowered it again and looked down. She looked at the board once more. The blank slot hadn't changed. No one had claimed it. No replacement crew, no redirect. Just one open line, one handler, one animal, location static. Her name wasn't written anywhere. She was still listed on her clearance badge as Logistics Shadow, which meant she could observe but not direct. She could be present, but not logged. The clipboard in her hands held nothing anyone in this room would read. She had filled it this morning anyway. A voice toward the side, half behind her now, said, "We're waiting on satellite drift to stabilize. They've probably holed up somewhere sheltered. If they're smart, they'll ride it out." Another added, "Storm's too close to the tree line. Anyone who tries to drop in gets blown right off the ledge." Someone near the back zipped a vest pocket and checked his watch. "Birds won't be cleared before 1300 hours. No exception protocol in this air window." She remained still. Her gloves hadn't moved. The clipboard sat straight against her forearm, the corner just touching her hip. The dry air inside the tent did nothing to soften the quiet that formed around her. It wasn't personal. It never was. A shift lead turned to double-check the board. "Everything else is accounted for," he said. "We can reassign lift teams by 1400 if the window opens. Till then, hold." The group dispersed slowly. Some peeled off toward the side table where coffee waited. Others returned to their gear. The heater buzzed louder for a moment, then dropped back. She stood until the last man moved away from the display. Then she stepped forward and tapped her gloved finger once, lightly, against the blank slot. The surface squeaked faintly under her touch. She didn't write anything. She didn't speak again. The board remained unchanged. Outside, the wind howled hard enough to shake the tarp edge loose from one hook. The flap slapped once, twice, then held. She turned and stepped through it without pause. The cold air found her immediately, slipping behind her collar and stinging her cheeks. It was brighter out here than it had been earlier. Not lighter, just brighter with snow. The sky pressing down from above. Behind her, inside the tent, the noise resumed. Voices discussing flight intervals, radial patterns, reassignment logic. No one followed. No one stopped her. She crossed the compound alone, the clipboard still under her arm, her name still missing from every board. The K-9 team had not moved, and now neither would anyone else. The hangar was nearly empty. The overhead lights flickered under power strain, humming softly above rows of quiet equipment and grounded aircraft. Outside, the storm had gathered speed. Snow curled through the open loading gaps, swirling in quick spirals across the concrete. The wind slammed once against the eastern shutter, then retreated. She stepped through the threshold and paused just inside, scanning the shadows. Rotor wash echoed faintly in the distance, but nothing moved here. One UH-60 sat parked beneath the nearest support beam, frost clinging to its skids and engine housing. A tarp hung half loose over the nose cone, stiff with cold. She crossed the hangar floor without hesitation, boots crunching grit and ice, gloves clipped at her side. She reached the aircraft and began unfastening the cover, moving with clean, economical motion. Each tie released in rhythm, pulled and folded back. No wasted effort. The fabric slapped once in the wind, then dropped over the far edge. She ran a hand along the frame, checking the seam points. No ice buildup. Panels flush. She bent to check the lower fuselage, her shoulder brushing the snow-dusted belly. The pre-flight was silent. She didn't call it out. She walked the length of the bird, stopping to touch each control surface in order: stabilizer, tail rotor, skid tension. Her hand settled briefly on the access panel near the co-pilot's seat, then moved to the crew hatch. Nothing about her motion said improvisation. It was all muscle memory. Inside the cockpit, the cold hit harder. The seats were stiff, canvas edges rimed in frost. She pulled the gloves from her belt, slid them on, and sat. The harness clicked over her shoulder. The switchboard glowed faint orange, slow to boot in the low temperature. She adjusted one dial, flipped the battery isolation switch, and waited for the system to prime. She typed in her clearance code. The screen returned a blinking prompt: flight status denied, no crew listed. Her finger hovered for less than a second. Then she reached to the left side of the console and opened a locked panel. Inside, a single mechanical switch sat behind a plastic guard. She flipped the guard up and turned the override key she carried on a thin chain around her neck. The confirmation tone was low and smooth. Engines 2 and 3 spooled up in sequence. The first hum deepened into a whine, then into the rolling growl of rotor engagement. The blades above began to turn, slow at first, then faster. The tail kicked gently with the first wave of spin. The aircraft shuddered as systems came online. Overhead, a voice called from the metal catwalk above the maintenance station. "That bird's not cleared." She didn't look up. The nav screen blinked once more. Wind vectors flashed in digital arcs across the terrain model. She ignored it, adjusted heading manually. Trim set low, nose pitch corrected by 2 degrees. The storm hit the side of the hangar again, louder this time. The bay door trembled under the force. She pushed the throttle forward. The UH-60 lifted off slowly, tires separating from concrete with visible hesitation. Snow scattered in all directions. A second shout echoed from the catwalk, lost under the full torque of the rotor wash. The aircraft climbed. Across the base, inside the tower, a technician leaned toward his monitor. A new radar blip appeared, just north of Hangar 2. He adjusted the resolution. No call sign, no beacon, just a pulsing return moving west by northwest, climbing in bad weather. "Who's that?" he asked. No one answered. In the adjacent control room, an officer looked up from the status screen. "Was that one of ours?" The technician tapped the monitor. "No one's logged. No filed departure. But she's in the air." The UH-60 banked left over the perimeter fence, nose cutting into the storm line. Visibility collapsed as she passed through the first wave of sleet. The aircraft trembled slightly, then steadied as she adjusted the stabilizer trim with 2 fingers. Inside the cockpit, her face remained still. One gloved hand rested on the cyclic. The other reached forward, brushing a handwritten note she had taped beneath the altimeter earlier that week. Coordinates, wind direction, estimated terrain drift. She didn't check the radio. No call would come. She adjusted her heading by 6 degrees and climbed to 1,000 feet. Below, the world disappeared into white. She reached the outer range of the ridgeline 10 minutes later. Crosswinds pulled hard from the west, but she compensated without delay. One panel buzzed from static, then cleared. The GPS flickered again. She tapped the screen, then turned it off entirely. The storm raged against the glass. The UH-60 pushed into it with steady force, turbine pitch climbing. The airframe shook once, then held. Inside the tower, a second officer stepped to the radar station. "She's still climbing," the tech said. "No call sign. No record." The officer stared at the screen. She wasn't on the manifest. "Then who is that?" the tech asked. There was no reply. Outside, the aircraft kept climbing. The snow swallowed the sound behind her. Nothing else moved in the air. She was already past the first ridge, and closing on the grid square no one else would reach. The mountain pass narrowed fast. Wind poured down from the higher ridge like pressure through a funnel. Snow whipped in hard sheets against the windshield, leaving no horizon, no depth, only flashes of terrain as it appeared and vanished in the same breath. She flew by feel, not by sight. The hand-marked map tucked beside her seat had been committed to memory. Rock walls, tree lines, Wind chop over the second shelf. Her hands stayed steady on the controls, making constant, quiet corrections. The aircraft shuddered with each shift in airflow. The left skid dipped briefly before she corrected, one eye on altitude, one ear tuned to engine tone. She descended lower, skimming treetops she couldn't see, trusting the gap she had practiced for months without anyone watching. The storm roared outside. Inside. It was all rotors. Pulse. Breath. A small green blink lit on the secondary screen. Faint signal. 70% distortion. She adjusted gain. The beacon signature was weak but matched the K-9 collar frequency. Static cleared long enough for a flicker of position to register just under the southern shelf, near the rock ledge that bordered the outflow ravine. She banked right. Adjusted speed, dropped 200 meters and kept the pitch level. The terrain opened just enough for one pass. Ice laced the edges of the glass. Her hands never left the trim. She circled once, close to the rock face, nose angled slightly upward to keep the lift line clean. Heat signature showed low. One human, one smaller mass nearby, unmoving, but alive. Second pass. She lowered to 10 meters above surface. Wind blasted through the gap, pressing the bird sideways. She shifted weight, let the skids absorb the tilt. The landing wasn't soft. It was deliberate. One hard touchdown and hold. Rear ramp drop before full balance. She unclipped, moved to the cabin door, and stepped into the white. The wind hit like a body. She leaned forward against it, boots sinking fast into snowpack. The K-9 stood 10 meters ahead, half sheltered behind the fallen handler. The dog didn't bark. It didn't charge. It simply watched her, eyes fixed, ears flat, breath visible in short bursts. She didn't speak. She knelt. One hand reached slowly toward the ground, palm open. The gloves were the same ones she had worn on her last dog evac. The leather still held the faint scent of hydraulic oil and field gear. The K-9 stepped forward, 2 paces, then another. She reached the handler. Snow had crusted along his collar. One leg was wrapped in a field splint. Blood had frozen at the edge of the wrap, but the breathing was steady. She pressed 2 fingers to his neck, then checked his chest. Shallow rise. Not failing. She clipped the evac harness onto his chest rig, adjusted the tension line, and leaned into the lift. Her boots braced in the snow as she pulled. He slid slightly as she repositioned. The dog moved with them, staying close but not interfering. Together, they reached the ramp. She guided the handler up, inch by inch, until his back touched the inner floor. She turned once, reached out again, and the dog stepped forward without hesitation. Inside, the wind dropped to a muffled roar. The door shut with a hydraulic grind. She caught her breath once, gloves on her knees. Snow melted across the deck. The dog stood beside the handler, eyes alert, but still. She took one more look, checked the latch on the harness again, and returned to the cockpit. Engine gauges ticked low. She adjusted throttle, leaned in, and listened for the slight rise in turbine tone. The bird responded. She took off again with a tilt and a shudder, climbing fast to avoid the next gust surge. Ice split across the windshield. She wiped once, manually, then kept flying. The pass narrowed behind her. Updraft caught the tail and kicked sideways. She corrected by half step. Trim pulled 1 click. Altitude gain at 60 meters per second. Gauges flickered. She ignored the flicker, focused on the line ahead. In the tower, one technician stared at the radar screen. "That bird's climbing through the pass," he said. "Still no call sign." A second voice asked, "Who's flying it?" The tech blinked. "No one's logged." The aircraft crested the last shelf. Sky still white. No visual range. But she knew the slope had cleared. The wind shifted again, signaling the edge of the weather wall. She angled the nose down slightly, gained speed, and held. Back in the cabin, the K-9 lay beside the handler. Snow melted into the grooves of the deck. Her breath fogged the cockpit glass as she passed the final outcropping and turned toward the base. The landing pad came into view seconds before touchdown. Visibility at 30 meters. She dropped fast, gear absorbing the hit. Ground crews scattered from the tower entrance, rushing toward the bird. Rotors still spun as she powered down, but she opened the cabin door anyway. The med team reached her first. One lifted the handler, called vitals, shouted for a sled. The dog stepped down on its own, shaking snow from its coat, then circled once before returning to the handler's side. One crewman stood back from the noise, pulling off his goggles. He watched her step down alone from the cockpit. Her braid was stiff with ice. Her gloves dripped meltwater. She didn't say a word. Inside the tower, the technician highlighted the flight log. Still blank. Who logged the flight, he asked again. No one answered. The manifest remained unchanged. On the pad, the aircraft blades slowed to a crawl. The storm began to break. The snow kept falling, but it no longer owned the sky. The storm had broken. Not fully, but enough. The snow still fell, but slower now, in fine strands that barely moved in the air. The sky had softened into a dull gray, no longer pressing down with force, only hanging there with cold intent. The wind had faded to a distant hush, curling around the edge of the compound like something that no longer needed to prove itself. She walked down the ramp with her boots soaked through and her braid stiff with frozen sleet. Her gloves were still on, but the fingers sagged slightly from melt. Behind her, the UH-60 sat idle, engines powered down, rotors slowing with each rotation. Steam rose from the tail boom, drifting upward into the quiet. Across the tarmac, the tent lights glowed dim through the plastic. She crossed the yard with no urgency. The snow didn't resist her anymore. It simply gave way. Inside the operations tent, the heater clicked once and settled. The air was warmer than before, but not by much. Most of the crew had returned. The chatter had stopped. Screens were still lit, tablets still open, but no one said anything as she stepped through the flap. She didn't pause. She didn't remove her gloves or wipe her boots. She walked across the floor, past the mission table, past the side wall where the manifest still hung. Her name was still missing. She didn't stop to correct it. The eyes were there. She felt them. Quiet. Watching. A man in a base tech vest stepped forward. He was younger than her by 10 years. Maybe more. He had dark hair, wind-chapped cheeks, and the posture of someone who had never quite known where to stand in a room like this. He didn't salute. He just nodded. Once. Nothing rehearsed. Nothing performative. She met his gaze, held it for a second, then moved on. Behind him, near the secondary board, someone picked up a dry erase marker. A line was erased support only and nothing was written in its place. The board remained blank where her role should have gone. She crossed to the table near the back where the duty logs were kept. A clerk looked up as she approached. He opened a binder, started to flip through it, then paused. The page he had landed on was hers. It was empty. He didn't speak. He didn't offer the pen. She didn't reach for it. Instead, she left the tent. The door flap swung closed behind her with a soft sound, not loud, just final. The barracks were still. No voices, no boots on the walk, no lights in the windows except for the faint green glow of night lamps left on standby. She walked down the corridor to her bunk and stepped inside. The air was cooler here, untouched by the warmth of body heat or conversation. Her cot looked the same. The folded blanket. The map pinned above. The crate at the side with the logbook placed just so. She took off her gloves slowly and draped them across the edge of the heater pipe. They sagged slightly from the weight of snowmelt. Fingertips curled inward like they were still holding the controls. She sat down on the cot, took the logbook in her hands, opened it to the next clean page. The pen was there, clipped to the spine, where it always was. She wrote the date, the time, 0317. Then one line, UH-60, unlisted flight, Ridge pass clearance. K-9 and handler recovered. Solo lift. Return complete. She signed it. Not for anyone else. Just for the page. Just for the record that wouldn't be read. She closed the book and set it on the crate. Leaned back against the cot frame and looked once toward the narrow window cut into the tent wall. The sky outside was lighter than before. Not clear, but shifting. The edge of dawn had started to press into the dark. It painted the clouds in a soft gradient white fading into silver, then into blue-gray at the upper edge. She didn't reach for anything else, didn't speak, didn't move for a long time. The gloves dried slowly beside the pipe. Steam lifted from the creases. The aircraft outside remained where it had landed. No one touched it. No one spoke its name. The silence was not empty. It was full, and it held. She was never meant to be the one who flew. Not by the system, not by the manifest, not by the room full of voices that never said her name. But she flew anyway. She moved with the kind of calm that comes from knowing who you are, even when no one else sees it. She didn't ask for recognition. She didn't wait for permission. And when it mattered most, she acted not to be noticed, but to make a difference. This was never about medals or applause. It was about showing up when others won't, about quiet strength, about knowing that sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one who says nothing at all. If that moved you, take a moment to reflect. Share your thoughts in the comments, and follow if you want to hear more stories of quiet courage, unspoken resolve, and the strength it takes to stand alone.